The first time I said no to my husband, he didn't say a word. He turned onto his side of the bed, and I lay there listening to him breathe, waiting for anger that never came. I was 22 years old. Outside the window, the wind was moving through the corn, that dry, rattling sound corn makes in late September. And somewhere down the lane, a dog barked twice and went quiet. I remember thinking foolishly that silence meant I had won something. I did not yet understand that in my community, silence was never empty. Silence was the first move in a game I did not know I was playing, and I would spend the next 4 years learning its rules the way Amish women always learn things quietly, sideways, from women who would not look at me while they told me the truth. My name is Martha. This is the Amish Stories, the channel where I tell the stories the outside world never hears because the women who live them were taught that a closed mouth gathers no trouble. I grew up Old Order Amish in Holmes County, Ohio, in a district so small that everyone's grief and everyone's shame belonged in some quiet way to everyone. I was married at 19. I left at 26. In between those two ages is everything I am going to tell you today. Before I go on, I want to ask you something because I read every single comment you leave me, every one. Have you ever been taught that saying no was a sin? Not against a person, but against God Himself? If you have, I want you to tell me in the comments. And if this is your first time here, please subscribe and press the little bell so you don't miss what comes next, because there is a great deal more I have not yet said. In the outside world, refusal is a sentence. In my community, it was the beginning of a process, one that had no official name, the way many things in Amish life exist without ever being written down. There is no line in the Ordnung, the unwritten code that lives not on paper, but in the air of every kitchen and barn, that says a wife must never say no to her husband. And yet everyone knew what happened to a wife who did. Everyone knew. No one said. The hierarchy was simple, and it was taught to us before we could read. God, then the bishop, then the husband, then the wife, then the children. A wife submits, a husband leads. We were given the verses, Ephesians, Corinthians, one line at a time, folded into sermons that lasted 4 hours on backless benches until the words sat in us the way a stone sits in a field, permanent, unmovable, something you built your rows around instead of removing. The word we were given for this was Gelassenheit, yielding, the quiet surrender of the self to God's order. And the word we feared most, the word used only about women, was Hochmut, pride. A woman who asked a question had pride. A woman who wanted rest had pride. A woman who said not tonight twice had more pride than the community could comfortably carry. I met my husband, Jonas, at a Sunday singing when I was 17. He was quiet in the way most of the boys were quiet, but there was something gentler in him, a kind of carefulness with his hands and his voice that made the other girls tease me for weeks afterward. We married on a Thursday in late October, the way most weddings there are held on a Tuesday or a Thursday, never a weekend, because weekends belong to rest and to God. 300 people came. There was roast chicken and creamed celery and 7 kinds of pie laid along the windowsill of my mother's kitchen, and 4 hours of preaching before any of us ate a bite. Jonas was not cruel. I want to say that clearly because this is not a story about a monster. He was a man who had been raised inside the same silence I had been raised inside, handed a script before he ever learned there was a choice about whether to read it. Our first son was born 11 months after the wedding, in the upstairs room with the blue curtains, delivered by a midwife who did not look up from her hands the entire time. It was 2 years later, after our second child, when I said no for the first time. Not loudly. Not even with much thought behind it. My body was tired in a way that had become its permanent condition, a tiredness that lived in the joints, and one night I simply turned my face to the wall and said, "Not tonight." Jonas said nothing. The next morning, he ate his breakfast without a word to me, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. Not that day, not the next, not the day after that did he speak to me beyond what was necessary to run a household. Pass the milk, the plow needs mending, the Yoders are coming Sunday. I want you to understand how small this sounds from the outside. A husband gone quiet over one sentence. That is exactly the point. The trigger is always something an English person would find laughably small. The response was never in proportion to the crime. That disproportion was the punishment. The cold shoulder lasted 6 days before my mother in law came to visit, arriving with a basket of eggs she did not need to deliver in person. She sat at my table and told me, while her hands kept moving, shelling peas she had also not needed to bring, that a wife who lets the cold in cannot complain when the house freezes. She did not look at me when she said it. She looked at the peas. I did not understand yet that this was tier two of something with no name, a warning delivered in Proverbs by a woman who loved me and could not or would not say anything more direct. 3 days after that, my husband's sister stopped by with coffee and talked for 20 minutes about everything except what she had come to talk about. And then, at the door, with her hand already on the latch, she said that a marriage bed was not a place for opinions. I remember standing very still after she left, the coffee going cold on the table, and understanding for the first time that this was choreography. Someone somewhere had decided the order of these visits. No one had discussed it aloud. It simply happened, tier by tier, the way water finds its level. The following week, at a quilting frolic, an older woman named Lydia sat beside me at the frame, and while she threaded her needle, without once turning her head toward me, she said this: "They do not hit us. That is not our way. What they do is harder." Then she pulled her thread through the fabric and said nothing else for the rest of the afternoon. I have turned that sentence over in my mind more times than I can count in the years since. They do not hit us. What they do is harder. Lydia died 4 years later before I left, and I never had the chance to ask her what she meant by harder, though by then I no longer needed to ask. I had lived the answer. If you have stayed with me this long, thank you. I know these stories are not easy to hear, and they were not easy to live either. If something in this is resonating with you, please take a moment to subscribe, because there is so much more of this story, and I promise you it goes somewhere. Between Lydia's words at the quilting frame and what came next, there was a stretch of ordinary days that I remember more vividly than almost anything else, because ordinary days are where this kind of pressure does its quietest work. I still made breakfast every morning: eggs, fried mush, coffee boiled on the stove until it was almost black. Jonas still ate at the same table, across from me, and by then he was speaking to me again about the things that needed speaking of: the fence that needed mending, the calf that was slow to nurse, whether the Millers would bring their buggy to the auction on Saturday. From the outside, if an English person had looked through our kitchen window, they would have seen a marriage. They would not have seen that every kind word he offered me now came wrapped in a silence around the one subject that mattered most, and that the silence itself had become its own kind of language, one I had grown fluent in without ever agreeing to learn it. I began to notice how many of the women in my own family spoke this language too. My mother, my aunts, women who had been married 30 and 40 years and who could carry on a full conversation about canning tomatoes while somehow also communicating, in a look or a pause, exactly what was and was not permitted to be said. A body that has been working a long time learns to carry things it was never taught to name. The bishop's wife came next, on an afternoon in November when frost had already killed the last of the garden. She sat in my front room with her hands folded and told me, gently, that a wife's body belonged first to God, then to her husband, and that a marriage that grew cold in one room grew cold in every room of a house, and soon the whole house would need to be rebuilt from the foundation. She smiled the entire time she said it. I understood, the way you understand weather changing before the first drop of rain falls, that the temperature in my own home had become a matter the entire district considered its business. The bishop himself came 2 weeks later. He sat in our warmest room, the one with the good stove, and there was pie set out on the windowsill, though no one asked me who had told him to expect it. He never raised his voice, he never needed to. He spoke instead of the community, of how much they valued Jonas and me, of how a young family was the district's greatest treasure and its greatest responsibility, and how none of them wanted to lose us. "We do not want to lose you," he said, and it took me years and a good deal of distance to understand that this sentence was not comfort. It was the shape a threat takes, when it has been raised inside gentleness its whole life and never had to become anything sharper. I want to be honest with you about what happened after that visit, because this is the part of the story that is hardest to say plainly, and I will not describe it in detail. Some things do not need description to be understood, and some things should never be turned into a spectacle for anyone's entertainment. What I will tell you is that the pressure did not stop with words. It moved into the house itself, into what was expected of me in rooms no one else ever entered, into the quiet understanding that refusal, if it continued, would not simply be met with silence from Jonas or proverbs from his mother. It would be met with the full weight of a community that considered a wife's body a shared resource of the household rather than her own. No one wrote this down. No one needed to. It lived the way many things in Amish life live, in the space between sermons, understood by every married woman in that room, and named by none of them. That autumn, my friend Rebecca, who had married the same year I had, sat across from me at her own kitchen table and said very quietly that she had begun to wonder if there was a way to imagine a different life. Rebecca was the first person who let me say the word leaving out loud without either of us flinching. We did not make a plan that day. We simply sat with the idea between us like something newly hatched, too fragile yet to be handled. The decision itself did not arrive the way I once imagined decisions arrived, in a single dramatic moment. It came the way a season changes. So slowly you cannot name the day it happened, only that one morning you notice the light is different. Mine came while I was hanging laundry in late February, watching Jonas's shirts freeze stiff on the line in a matter of minutes, arm after arm lifted straight out by the cold, and I thought, not with anger, but with a strange, calm clarity, that I had been standing in that same spot pinning up the same shirts for 7 years, and that I could see, with total certainty, every year still ahead of me if nothing changed. I will not tell the story of how I left today. That belongs to a different video because it is long and it deserves its own telling, not a rushed ending tucked into someone else's story. What I will tell you is that I did leave, and that leaving cost me my mother's voice at the other end of a phone line, cost me Sunday dinners, and my sister's wedding, and my place at Lydia's funeral, because the shunning, the meidung, does not end when you walk out a door. It follows you the way frost follows a garden that was never covered in time. In the years since, I have sat across from a small, patient English woman in an office with plants on the windowsill and glasses she was always losing somewhere in her own hair. And she gave me words I did not have before. Coercive control, she called it, and reproductive coercion, and learned helplessness. Vocabulary my community had never given me, because giving me the words might have given me the ability to name what was happening while it was still happening. She did not tell me my husband was a monster. She told me instead that the framework was the mistake, not me. A system built across generations to make a woman's no cost more than her yes ever did. I want to say clearly because it matters to me that you hear this and not some easier version of it. Jonas was not a monster. My mother-in-law was not a monster. The bishop was not a monster. They were people standing inside a structure so old and so quiet that none of them could see its walls anymore, only feel. The way you feel a load-bearing wall by what happens when you try to remove it. That something in the whole house depended on my silence. Compassion for the people does not mean forgiveness of the system. Both things can be true. I have learned to hold both. If you grew up in a place where your body was not entirely your own, I see you. If you ever lay awake beside someone and said yes because you were too tired to survive, what a no would cost you, I see you. If you were ever taught that being good meant making yourself smaller and smaller until there was nothing left of you with which to refuse anything at all, I see you. You were not weak. You were surviving inside a structure that was built brick by unspoken brick to make sure a woman could never say no without paying a price for the privilege of having said it. Tell me in the comments what part of this story stayed with you the longest. Tell me your own story if you are ready to tell it. I read every single one, and I have never once regretted reading them. If you have not yet subscribed to the Amish stories, I would be grateful if you would, because there is so much more I have not yet said, and I intend to keep saying it, one story at a time, for as long as there are women listening who need to hear that they are not the first to feel what they are feeling, and they will not be the last. Until next time, choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life. Your no is a whole sentence. It always was.